Hey guys, John Catalano here from Diamond Audio. And on today's workshop, we're going to be talking about best practices for digital LOCs in modern vehicles. Let's get into it. Well, in most instances, most newer vehicles, you're going to need an LOC in every install, unless you're using some kind of data bus interface to derive signal. So there are some vehicles that do have a fixed line output, and those are going to be difficult to integrate with. But for all those other instances, we're going to be using a digital LOC. And the reason we need a digital LOC is because these modern vehicles have very high output on those lines. And we need to be able to handle that power. Our LOCs have 40 volts of input capability. That's going to allow you to do up to 400 watts of current on each one of those channels. That's a lot of power, and you can do it with a digital LOC. You can't do it with an old school resistor-based LOC. Well, the great thing about the digital LOCs, well, my favorite thing, and it's because I'm used to the old school ones, is that when you have that high power capability and you're not using resistors, they don't get hot because we're not putting it through resistance. We're using a digital circuit. So not only are they cleaner, but they're much smaller because they don't have to have these giant resistors to eat up all this current. Secondly, we can add things like load resistors because, again, on these modern vehicles, you're going to need some kind of load resistance to trick the factory amplifier into continuing to send signal because of its fault detection circuit that would kick in when you change the impedance or that speaker isn't connected anymore and it's just going to the LOC. So we're able to do that with a flip of a switch on the digital LOC. So that's a great benefit there. And then finally, we want to be able to keep noise out of the system. And we do that in two ways. We have noise isolation built in right onto the digital LOC, so you can flip a switch. You can change through the three options where you have ground, you have floating ground, or you have resistance to ground. And those will keep the noise floor nice and low and keep any interaction between the components from talking to each other. And then finally, 10-volt outputs. So that way we have lots of headroom and we can keep those gains on those new amplifiers really, really low, if not off altogether. So you have very, very little chance of noise and still have great dynamic range. Actually, that gets asked a lot. Do I need a DSP if I'm using a digital LOC? And the answer is yes. Basically, you're going to get your signal is going to get derived from the digital LOC, and then you can feed that into your DSP of choice, so you can adjust for the other abnormalities there may be. There may be a factory EQ that's in play that you need to compensate for. You may have some poor speaker placements that you need to compensate for, cancellations, things of that nature, and just customizing the sound to the customer's needs. So definitely a DSP is a great addition to having the digital LOC, but the digital LOC is going to give you that pathway to be able to get signal to your DSP and keep that signal nice and clean. Well, I could give you a few specific examples. Let's say you're doing this. Actually, it's not even as modern now, but it's still very relevant. If you were doing a Ford Flex, that vehicle has the Ford system has fault protection. So if you disconnect that factory sub, the amplifier shuts down. Now you have no sound in the vehicle at all. It also uses a very low voltage turn on trigger. So there's an auto turn on the digital LOCs, which I forgot to mention earlier. Um, that's going to allow you to be able to use signal sensing to turn on the LOC. So when the factory system starts, it continues the play, turns on your new amplifiers. And then that load resistance is going to keep that amplifier happy, the factory amp, so it continues to send signal. And then finally, the signal in those vehicles isn't very high, so you're allowed to boost that signal so you can keep the noise floor down to a minimum, because in that particular vehicle, the factory amp turns on when you open the door. It does its door chimes and things like that through the factory system. So if you had like a noisy setup or you had the gains up really high on your new amplifiers, you might hear some noise floor with no music playing because you had to have those gains boosted. But instead of having to have the gains boosted, we can boost that in the LOC, and then the gains can be really low, if not off altogether, on your new amplifiers, and then you have no chance of noise. Well, the BE1 is really my favorite of all the units. It's because you get all the benefits of the digital LOCs that we already talked about, the load resistors, the 40 volt in, the 10 volt out, the line conditioner, and the uh, load resistors. But finally, it adds bass enhancement. And when I say bass enhancement, I'm not talking just like a bass boost. This is integrated circuit. It looks at the audio signal and it derives extra bass information from the signal that's already there. So you have a separate remote for this. It gives you a level control like it would normally do on a subwoofer channel, but it also gives you the enhancement so you can adjust how much of that effect you're adding to your bass signal. Now, why would you want to have this? Well, in these vehicles that we talked about, some of these modern vehicles, they have an EQ that literally lowers the bass as you turn the volume up. So now you can compensate for that. Or maybe the music you listen to doesn't have a lot of bass information, but you want it to, like Latin music, older rock and roll. I mean, even if you're talking classical or maybe even some, fully acoustic jazz, something like that, you can go ahead and make that sound fuller by adding the enhancement. And then if you're listening to something that doesn't quite need it as much, you can dial it back off. You're not set. We're having it just cranking all the time. You can have it set up the way you want. It's a great, great piece and nice and small. All right, so at the end of the day, digital LLCs are here. We need them. You're going to need this to work with most of the newer vehicles. You just got to have it if you want a clean signal. You don't want melting LOCs in the trunk. You can use an older one in these vehicles, but that customer is going to come back. You don't want returns that, you're not doing the customer or yourself any service. Digital LLCs are where you need to be going to be able to integrate into these newer vehicles. And we've got the right solutions for you at Diamond. All right, well, now you have it. Thanks for tuning into this workshop. My name's John Catalano from Diamond Audio, and you can get more information on all our digital LOCs at diamondaudio.com, and we'll see you on the next one.